Story. Struggling farmer lends his phone to a lost traveler, unaware she's a billionaire seeking true love. The first light of dawn was a shy thing at Providence Ridge. It crept over the eastern hills, a whisper of gold and rose that touched the mist lingering in the hollows. For Liam Davies, this was the only time of day the farm felt like his own. Before the sun climbed high enough to bake the cracked earth and illuminate the peeling paint on the barn, before the full weight of the day settled onto his shoulders, there was this moment. Just him, the damp chill of the pre-dawn air, and the quiet, breathing land. He stood near the western fence line, his breath a faint cloud in the air. At 30, he had the weathered look of a man a decade older. His hands, resting on a fence post his grandfather had sunk into the earth 70 years ago, were a map of his struggle, calloused, scarred, with a permanent layer of soil etched into the lines of his palms. He leaned his weight against the post, the familiar groan of old wood, a comfort. This wasn't just land, it was a living chronicle of his bloodline. Every stone turned, every furrow plowed, was a verse in a story he was terrified he was about to end. He pushed himself off the fence and began his morning walk, a ritual as old as his ability to walk itself. His boots, the leather cracked and soft as cloth, made soft thuds on the packed earth. He ran a hand over the rough bark of the old oak that stood sentinel in the middle of the first pasture. His father had told him it was the heart of the farm. "This land remembers, Liam," he'd said, his voice thinned by illness but still firm. "It remembers who takes care of it." Lately, Liam felt the land's memory was a judgment. He saw not the triumphs of his ancestors, but the shadow of his own failures. The fields, while neat, were not thriving. 2 years ago, a brutal summer-long drought had baked the life from them, and they had never fully recovered. The stream that bordered the property ran shallow, a pale imitation of the gushing artery he remembered from his boyhood. He was a good farmer, a hard worker, but hard work couldn't make the sky open up, nor could it turn back time to erase the mountain of medical debt his father's long, losing battle with cancer had left behind. Returning to the farmhouse was like stepping back 50 years. It was a sturdy, honest house, but it was tired. He could feel its weariness in the creak of the porch steps and see it in the faded blue of the front door. He ignored the insistent red light blinking on the answering machine. He knew it was just another call from a number he didn't recognize, with a voice that would be syrupy sweet or coldly professional, but always demanding something he didn't have. He picked up the small stack of mail from the floor by the mail slot. Bills, junk mail, a flyer from the local feed store, and then one that made the breath catch in his throat. It was a crisp, innocuous white envelope, but it felt heavier than all the others combined. It was from the Northridge Financial Group, the company that had given him the loan 2 years ago when the local bank had turned him down. He'd known their terms were steep, but desperation was a powerful motivator. He carried it to the kitchen, the heart of the home, where a faded photograph of his smiling parents hung on the wall. They were young, vibrant, standing in the very spot he was now. He stared at his father's proud expression before his gaze dropped to the envelope in his hands. With a tremor he couldn't control, he tore it open. The language was cold, corporate, and absolute. Words like delinquency, breach of contract, and final notice leaped off the page. But it was the phrase in bold, blood-red ink that made the world tilt on its axis. Notice of foreclosure auction. The date was set for 30 days from now. 30 days until the story of Providence Ridge, the legacy of the Davies family, would be sold to the highest bidder on the courthouse steps. A wave of nausea washed over him. He sank into one of the rickety kitchen chairs, the letter rattling in his hand. This was it, the final chapter. He wasn't just losing a home or a job. He was losing his identity, the very ground that held his history. He thought of his grandfather, a man built of iron and resilience, who had survived the Great Depression on this very land. He thought of his father, who had handed him the deed with a weak but hopeful hand and said, "It's yours now, son. Keep its heart beating." Rage, hot and useless, surged through him. He snatched the phone from its cradle on the wall, his knuckles white as he dialed the number on the letterhead. He had to try. He had to do something other than just sit here and drown. The phone rang twice before a clipped, professional voice answered. "Northridge Financial, this is Henderson." "My name is Liam Davies," Liam said, his voice tight. "My account, my farm, you sent me a letter." "Ah, yes, Mr. Davies. Account 714B, Henderson replied, his tone utterly devoid of emotion, as if he were reading a grocery list. "I have your file right here. You're significantly past due." "I know that," Liam snapped, then immediately regretted his tone. He took a breath, forcing himself to be calm. "Listen, I just need a little more time. The harvest is a few weeks away. If the yield is good, I can make a substantial payment. I just need an extension." He hated the pleading tone in his own voice. There was a pause, filled only with the faint sound of keyboard clicks. "Mr. Davies," Henderson said, his voice dripping with condescension, "we extended that courtesy 3 months ago. The time for good faith has passed. Sentiment doesn't pay interest." "This is my family's home," Liam said, his voice cracking. "It's been in my family for 3 generations. And in 30 days, it will be the bank's asset," Henderson said coolly. "The auction is scheduled. It is, I'm afraid, out of my hands. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" The finality in the man's voice was like a physical blow. There was no negotiation, no humanity. He was just a number in a file, a liability to be cleared. "No," Liam whispered. "There's nothing else." He didn't remember saying goodbye, only the hollow click as Henderson hung up, severing the last, thin thread of hope. Liam slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle. The silence that filled the kitchen was deafening. He looked at the photograph of his parents, at their hopeful smiles, and a profound, crushing shame washed over him. He pushed himself up from the table and walked numbly out onto the porch, the foreclosure notice still clutched in his fist. The sun was higher now, its warmth no longer gentle but harsh, exposing every flaw. The light glinted off the dusty windows and the rust spots on his old pickup truck. The land, his land, stretched out before him, looking vast and indifferent. He sank onto the top step, the wood groaning under his weight. He had fought so hard. He had worked until his muscles screamed and his bones ached. He had sacrificed sleep, friendships, and any chance of a life beyond these fences. For what? To end up here, a 30-year-old man with nothing to his name but a ticking clock. The breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak, a sound that had always brought him peace. Now, it sounded like a sad, final sigh. He looked out at the horizon, at the endless expanse of a world that didn't care about his legacy or his pain. He was the end of the line, the one who had failed the soil, the memories, and the name Davies. And in the crushing weight of that reality, he didn't see how anything, or anyone, could possibly save him now. The air in the Vance Corporation boardroom on the 54th floor was so perfectly climate-controlled it felt lifeless. It was an atmosphere of brushed steel, smoked glass, and the hushed, reverent tones of men who were paid to agree. Sunlight, sharp and brilliant, streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the city's concrete canyons, but no one looked at it. Their focus was entirely on the woman sitting at the head of the long obsidian table. Elara Vance. To the world, she was the brilliant, beautiful heiress to a global tech and logistics empire, the Vance & Vance Corp. Today, she was dressed in a tailored navy blue suit that cost more than most people's cars, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon. Her expression was one of cool, placid neutrality, a mask she had perfected over a decade of boardrooms just like this one. A vice president named Simmons, a man whose ambition was far more apparent than his talent, was concluding his presentation on quarterly growth projections. He clicked to his final slide, which showed a graph with a dramatic upward curve. And so, with the successful acquisition of the Helios freight network, Simmons beamed, his eyes darting to Elara for approval. "We are projecting a 17% increase in Q4 revenue. An unprecedented surge, Miss Vance, truly." Elara didn't look at the screen. She had already read the report, the real one, not this sanitized slideshow, and had identified the flaw 3 days ago. She let the silence stretch, a subtle instrument of power she often employed. Simmons's smile began to falter. "Unprecedented," she finally said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of command. "Except that your projection fails to account for the impending port union strike in Singapore, which my office flagged last Tuesday. It also conveniently omits the rising fuel surcharges tied to the new maritime regulations. Your unprecedented surge is actually a 3% gain, at best. And for the cost of the acquisition, a 3% gain is not a success, Mr. Simmons. It's a liability." The air went still. Simmons's face turned a blotchy red. He stammered, fumbling for a response that didn't exist. Alara simply gave him a small, dismissive nod, her gaze already shifting to the next item on the agenda. Next. She was sharp, she was intelligent, and she was suffocatingly bored. This was her life. A series of predictable problems, solved with predictable applications of money and power, surrounded by men who told her what they thought she wanted to hear. That evening, the gilded cage only became more ornate. The charity gala was a glittering affair held in a museum, where the city's wealthiest citizens mingled amongst ancient artifacts, their diamonds competing with the flash of photographers' bulbs. Alara moved through the crowd with practiced grace, a glass of untouched champagne in her hand, her smile, a beautiful, empty piece of armor. She was cornered near a Grecian statue by Julian Croft, tall, impeccably handsome, and a rising star in the world of hedge funds. Julian was the man her father's board of directors considered the perfect match, a merger of dynasties. "Alara," he said, his smile showing perfectly white teeth, "you look magnificent. That dress is a masterpiece." "Thank you, Julian," she said. "It's a dress." He laughed, missing the wariness in her tone entirely. Always so direct. "I was just talking to your father. He mentioned the Helios acquisition. A bold move, very impressive." "It was a necessary one," she replied, her gaze sweeping the room. "My fund has been watching Vance stock climb all week," he continued, leaning in conspiratorially. "I'm telling all my top clients, whatever Alara Vance touches turns to gold." The compliment landed with a thud. He wasn't complimenting her. He was complimenting her stock price, her influence, her Midas touch. He saw her as a walking portfolio, a human stock ticker. She looked into his perfectly handsome face and felt nothing, less than nothing, a profound, hollow ache. She needed to escape. Making a polite excuse, she slipped away, finding a momentary refuge on a deserted balcony overlooking the city lights. Below, the traffic flowed like rivers of light. Thousands of people living lives she couldn't begin to imagine. Real lives, messy lives, lives that weren't plotted on a quarterly report. The loneliness she felt was so vast and acute it was a physical pain. 2 hours later, she was home, if you could call it that. Her penthouse apartment was a minimalist masterpiece of glass, chrome, and white marble, featured in 3 architecture magazines. It was as beautiful and as cold as a mausoleum. Priceless modern art adorned the walls, but it brought her no joy. It was just another asset. She had shed the gown and was now in simple silk pajamas, looking out the same floor-to-ceiling windows from her boardroom. The city lights sparkled below, but they felt a million miles away. "He called you a masterpiece." Alara didn't turn. She knew the voice of Marcus, her head of security for the past 15 years. He was a former Special Forces soldier in his late 50s, with a calm presence and eyes that missed nothing. He was the only person in the world she trusted implicitly. He stood in the doorway, a silent, steady presence. "He was talking about the dress," she said, her voice flat. "Or maybe my balance sheet. And the Helios deal? A liability," she murmured, repeating her earlier takedown. She finally turned to face him. The mask was gone. In her own home, with her only friend, her face was etched with a deep, consuming weariness. "Marcus, do you ever feel like you're just a collection of other people's expectations?" He considered the question seriously. "My expectation is to keep you safe, Alara, that's all." A faint smile touched her lips. "Exactly. It's real. It's a purpose. What's mine? To increase shareholder value? To be a good merger?" She walked over to the vast, empty living space and spread her arms. "I'm drowning in all this. I'm a brand, not a person. I want to feel something real. Just once." That's when the idea, a dangerous, wild seed that had been planted in her mind for months, finally broke through the surface. "I'm going to disappear," she said, her voice gaining a sudden energy. Marcus's expression remained neutral, but his posture stiffened slightly. "Disappear how?" "Not forever. A week. Maybe less," she said, pacing now, the plan taking shape as she spoke. "No security, no assistance, no black cars. I want to be a nobody. I want to drive until I'm in the middle of nowhere and see what happens. I want to meet someone who doesn't know the name Vance, who won't see dollar signs when they look at me. I want to see if anyone in this world is still kind, just for the sake of being kind." Marcus was silent for a long moment. The risks are significant, he said, his voice a low rumble of concern. The risk of staying here is worse, she countered, her eyes flashing with a desperate fire. I'll lose my mind, Marcus. I'll become one of them. A hollow shell in a designer dress. She laid out the plan. He would procure a nondescript, slightly older sedan for her. She would have a backpack with a change of clothes, some cash, and nothing else. No credit cards that could be traced, a burner phone that she would let die. I'll engineer a breakdown, she said. Something simple. A loose battery cable, a fouled spark plug. Something that will leave me stranded. And then what? He asked, his gaze steady. And then we see, she said simply. We see who stops. We see what they do. It's an experiment, a test of human nature. Marcus knew from the set of her jaw that this wasn't a debate. He had seen this look in her eyes only a handful of times, usually before she made a ruthless business decision that left her competitors reeling. It was her tell for when she was absolutely committed. His job was not to talk her out of it, but to make it as safe as humanly possible. I'll be on call, he said. It wasn't a question. A mile back. Always. You won't see me, but I'll be there. That's my non-negotiable term. She knew it was the best she would get. She nodded. Agreed. The next afternoon, Elara Vance, the billionaire heiress, ceased to exist. In her place was just Ellie, a woman in worn jeans, a faded t-shirt, and hiking boots, her hair tied back in a simple ponytail. She slipped into the driver's seat of a 10-year-old Ford sedan, its interior smelling faintly of pine air freshener. Marcus had done his job well. It was utterly anonymous. He handed her the keys. The check engine light will come on in about 50 miles, he said quietly. It's a sensor I rigged. It won't cause any real damage, but it'll stay on. The battery cable is set to jostle loose on a rough road. Find a good bump, and you'll be on foot. Thank you, Marcus, she said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. Be safe, Elada. She pulled out of the private garage and into the city traffic. For the first time in years, no one gave her a second glance. She was just another car in a sea of them. The feeling was intoxicating. She drove for hours, leaving the city and its towering glass sentinels behind, watching as the landscape softened into rolling hills and farmland. As Marcus had predicted, the check engine light flicked on, a tiny orange beacon of manufactured trouble. She ignored it, a thrill running through her. She was the ghost in the machine now, the author of her own story. Spotting a sign for a state route, a winding two-lane road that promised nothing but countryside, she made a snap decision. She flicked her turn signal on and veered off the main highway. The car bumped onto the less maintained asphalt, heading into the unknown. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. For the first time in a very long time, she had no idea what would happen next, and it was wonderful. The state route was rougher than Elara had anticipated. The sedan's suspension, not built for this kind of neglect, protested with every frost heave and pothole. It was perfect. She spotted a particularly nasty-looking dip in the road ahead, where the asphalt had crumbled away into gravel. Gripping the wheel, she aimed for it. The car jolted violently, a jarring shudder that ran up her spine. And then, silence. The engine died instantly. The dashboard lights flickered once and went dark. She coasted to a stop on the dusty shoulder, the momentum bleeding away until the car was motionless. The plan had worked flawlessly. The jolt had been enough to dislodge the battery cable Marcus had so expertly prepared. A triumphant smile touched her lips. Phase 1 complete, she whispered to the empty car. She tried the ignition for show, rewarded with the dead, clicking silence she expected. Then, she killed her burner phone, plunging its screen into blackness. She got out of the car, and the reality of her situation hit her with the force of a physical wave. The heat was the first thing she noticed, a heavy, oppressive blanket that seemed to rise from the shimmering asphalt. It was accompanied by a sound she hadn't truly heard in years, the overwhelming noise of absolute silence. There was no city hum, no distant sirens, no hum of technology, just the buzz of a lone insect and the faint rustle of wind through dry grass. The sky seemed enormous, a vast, indifferent blue dome. The feigned frustration of her plan quickly evaporated, replaced by a prickle of genuine unease. It was one thing to orchestrate this from a penthouse in the city. It was another to be standing here, truly alone, a tiny figure in a vast empty landscape. She looked in both directions. Nothing. Just the road stretching to a vanishing point, bordered by fields of tired-looking corn. Far in the distance, down a long, unpaved driveway, she could just make out the silhouette of a farmhouse and a barn. It looked miles away. Taking a deep breath, she shouldered her backpack, the unfamiliar weight a clumsy burden. She began to walk. The walk was a penance. The gravel on the driveway crunched loudly under her hiking boots, each step an announcement of her intrusion. Dust kicked up, clinging to her jeans and the sweat on her brow. The sun beat down relentlessly. This wasn't a pleasant hike. It was a physical stripping away of her former life. The manicured comfort of her world was gone, replaced by the raw, unfiltered reality of heat, dust, and exertion. With every step, she felt less like a billionaire playing a role and more like what she appeared to be, a tired, lost traveler. As she drew closer, details of the farm emerged. A fence that listed to one side, a tractor that looked like a museum piece, and a farmhouse that seemed to be held up by sheer force of will. A man was working near a rusty, ancient-looking water pump, his back to her. He was lean and focused, his movements efficient and weary. She stopped at the edge of the drive, feeling suddenly like a trespasser. What was she even doing here? This was a man's home, his life. Her experiment suddenly felt arrogant and invasive. But turning back was not an option. Swallowing her pride, she crunched forward. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding thin in the open air. "I'm so sorry to bother you." Liam froze at the sound of her voice. He straightened up slowly, his body tensing. Strangers were not a common sight, and rarely a welcome one. He turned, wiping a greasy hand on his worn jeans, his eyes narrowing against the sun's glare. He saw a woman standing there, looking out of place and flushed from the heat, a backpack slung over her shoulders. His first instinct was suspicion. His second, seeing the genuine exhaustion in her face, was concern. "Can I help you?" he asked. His tone wasn't unfriendly, but it was cautious, reserved. "I hope so," Ilara said, offering a small, tired smile. "My car broke down just up the road. It's completely dead. My phone is too." She held up the inert black rectangle as proof. "I know this is a huge imposition, but I was wondering if I could possibly borrow your phone for just a minute. I need to call for a tow. I can pay you for the call, of course." Liam's gaze flickered from her face to the dusty road behind her, then back again. He was thinking of the foreclosure notice sitting on his kitchen table, a document that screamed of his own inability to pay for things. The irony of this stranger offering to pay for a phone call, a trivial sum that still felt like a luxury to him, was not lost on him. He could have said no. He could have told her the nearest town was 5 miles east and sent her on her way. It would have been the easier, safer thing to do. But then he looked at her again. He saw past the dust and sweat and saw the vulnerability in her eyes. It was a look he recognized, the quiet panic of someone whose plans had just fallen apart. His own life felt like that every single day. His inherent kindness, buried under layers of debt and despair, stirred. "Don't worry about paying," he said, his voice softening slightly. "Come on up to the porch. Get out of the sun." Relief washed over Ilara, so potent it almost made her dizzy. "Thank you," she said, the words full of genuine gratitude. "Really, thank you." He led her to the shaded porch, the cool air, a welcome blessing. He disappeared inside and returned a moment later with a cracked, older model smartphone. "It's not much," he said, handing it to her, "but it makes calls." She took it, their fingers brushing for a fleeting second. His hand was rough and calloused, a workingman's hand. "This is perfect," she said. She sat on the top step, turning away slightly to give the illusion of privacy, and dialed Marcus. The conversation was quick, coded. "Marcus, it's me." "Yes, I'm fine. Listen, the plan has changed slightly. Send a standard vehicle to the coordinates I'm texting you, no frills, and give me an hour." She sent the text, ended the call, and handed the phone back to Liam, who was leaning against a post, giving her space. "Help is on the way," she said. "Thank you again. You're a lifesaver." "It's no trouble." An easy silence fell between them. It wasn't awkward. It was filled with the sounds of the farm, the distant lowing of a cow, the chirping of crickets starting their evening song. They both looked out over the fields. "It's a beautiful place," Ilara said softly. "So peaceful." A sad smile touched Liam's lips. It has its moments. He followed her gaze across the land. My grandfather used to say you could hear the land breathe out here if you just listened long enough. Alara turned to him, intrigued. What does it sound like? Liam seemed to consider the question seriously. He didn't dismiss it as a city person's fanciful notion. It sounds like potential, he said, his voice quiet, like the sound of corn growing after a good rain. He taught me how to read it, not from a book, but from the smell of the dust, the way the leaves on the old oak curl before a storm. He said the land never lies to you. It tells you exactly what it needs. His words struck a chord deep inside Alara. The land never lies. In her world, everything lied. Financial projections were lies. Compliments were lies. Smiles were lies. The idea of something so fundamentally honest was like a drink of cool water after a long thirst. It sounds like you were close, she said gently. He was the best man I ever knew, Liam said, a flicker of warmth in his eyes before it was clouded by a familiar shadow. I just wish I was half the farmer he was. Then, unexpectedly, he shared a piece of his burden. It's hard to keep a place like this going. Feels like the whole world's conspiring against the small guy sometimes. Here it was. The opening for her to feel pity, to see him as a charity case. But she didn't feel pity. She felt a profound respect. She looked at his tired face, his calloused hands, the stubborn pride in the set of his jaw, and saw a man engaged in a noble, losing battle. You seem like you've been lost before, she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. It was a projection of her own feelings, a moment of unplanned vulnerability. Liam looked at her, misinterpreting her meaning. Oh, I know this land like the back of my hand. Never been lost out here. I don't mean that way, she clarified softly. It's just, you can have a map, know exactly where you are, and still feel completely, utterly lost. He stared at her, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He didn't know the specifics of her life, but he recognized the sentiment. He saw a truth in her that went beyond her dusty clothes and broken-down car. For a moment, they weren't a farmer and a traveler. They were just two people sharing a quiet moment of existential weariness on an old porch. The spell was broken by the sight of a plain sedan kicking up dust as it made its way down the long drive. That'll be my ride, Alara said, standing and brushing the dust from her jeans. There was a genuine reluctance in her movement. An hour ago, she couldn't wait for this car to arrive. Now, she wished it had taken longer. She walked to the edge of the porch. I'm Ellie, by the way. Liam, he replied. Thank you, Liam. For everything. Anytime, Ellie. Safe travels. As she walked toward the waiting car, she turned back one last time. Liam was still standing on the porch, a solitary, resilient figure framed against his struggling farm. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that look, a silent acknowledgement passed between them. This had been more than a simple transaction. Climbing into the car, Alara didn't look at Marcus. She just stared out the window as they drove away, watching Liam's farm recede in the rearview mirror until it was just a silhouette against the setting sun. Her experiment was a success, she supposed. She had found kindness. But as she replayed their conversation in her mind, she realized her focus had shifted entirely. She wasn't thinking about her hypothesis on human nature anymore. She was thinking about the farmer who knew how to listen to the land. The sedan moved with a smooth, powerful hum, devouring the miles of highway that separated the dusty farm from the distant glow of the city. Inside, the silence was absolute. Marcus drove with quiet efficiency, his eyes on the road, occasionally glancing at the rearview mirror, not for traffic, but for any sign of a tail. Alara sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, watching the landscape transform from dark fields and sparse trees back into the familiar landscape of overpasses and electric lights. She felt a strange sense of temporal whiplash, as if she had been away for weeks, not hours. The woman who had walked up that dusty driveway felt like a different person from the one now encased in climate-controlled luxury. She could still feel the phantom weight of the backpack on her shoulders and the grit of dust on her skin. She couldn't shake the image of Liam. It wasn't his quiet country boy charm or rugged good looks that had imprinted on her mind. It was his hands strong, capable, and mapped with the story of his life's work. It was the profound sadness in his eyes when he spoke of his grandfather, a grief that was clearly still raw. Most of all, it was the raw, unvarnished honesty of his words. The land never lies. In her world, that was a revolutionary concept. They were approaching the city limits when she finally spoke, her voice startling in the quiet car. "Marcus." "Ma'am," he replied, his eyes still fixed ahead. "I want to know everything about him," she said, her tone no longer that of the lost traveler, Ellie, but of Alara Vance, CEO. It was a voice accustomed to issuing commands and expecting immediate results. The man, Liam Davies. The farm, Providence Ridge. The history, the ownership, the debt. I want to see the loan agreements, the payment history, the bank that holds the note. Everything. I want to know why a man like that is failing. Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "It will be done. And not the penthouse tonight," she added. "Find me a hotel. Something clean, quiet, and anonymous. I'm not ready to go back to the museum." He understood perfectly. The penthouse was the gilded cage. Tonight, she needed neutrality. An hour later, Alara stood in the center of a perfectly generic hotel room. Beige walls, beige carpet, a bland print of a sailboat above the bed. It was a room designed to be forgotten, which was precisely why she'd asked for it. She shed her dusty clothes, leaving them in a pile on the floor like a snakeskin she was eager to discard, and took a long, hot shower, washing away the grime of her adventure. But as the water sluiced over her, she couldn't wash away the feeling. The encounter had left an echo inside her. She contrasted the memory of Liam on his porch with the memory of Julian at the gala. Julian, who had appraised her like a prized racehorse. His compliments were transactions, his smile an invoice. Liam, who had nothing, had offered her help without asking for anything in return. He had looked at her, a complete stranger, and seen not an opportunity, but a person in need. He was a primary source in a world of derivative copies. She stepped out of the shower and wrapped herself in a thick, white towel. Her secure tablet, delivered by a silent Marcus, was sitting on the desk. She powered it on. The first file was already there, labeled L. Davies. Preliminary. She sat down, her hair dripping onto the hotel bathrobe, and began to read. Back at Providence Ridge, the dust from the sedan had long since settled, but the air still felt charged. Liam stood on the porch for a full 10 minutes after the car's taillights had vanished, replaying the entire encounter in his mind. He felt unsettled. The grim, monotonous rhythm of his life had been broken, and he didn't know what to do with the strange new silence. He finally shook his head, a wry, self-deprecating smile on his face. He was acting like a fool. He had 100 things to do before the sun went down. He walked over to the water pump he'd been tinkering with when she arrived. He picked up his wrench, his knuckles grazing the cold, greasy metal. But his focus was gone. His mind wasn't on the faulty gasket, it was on her. Ellie. He replayed their conversation, not the words so much as the way she'd said them. There was an intelligence in her eyes, a quickness that seemed at odds with her backpacker persona, and a deep, surprising melancholy. You can have a map and still feel completely, utterly lost. Who was she? Where did a phrase like that come from? She wasn't just a lost tourist. There was a story there, a depth he hadn't expected. For a foolish, fleeting moment, a spark of hope ignited in the darkness of his mind. A wild, ridiculous fantasy of her car breaking down again, of her coming back. He imagined showing her the farm properly, telling her the story of the old oak, of sharing a meal that wasn't from a can. He immediately crushed the thought, his grip tightening on the wrench. "Get your head out of the clouds, Davies," he muttered to himself, his own voice harsh. "She's a traveler. Passing through. Gone forever." He forced himself to focus on the pump, turning the wrench with a vicious twist. The metal groaned in protest. He was a farmer on the brink of ruin. He had no time for daydreams about mysterious women with sad eyes. Daydreams didn't pay the bank. With the pump temporarily fixed, he trudged back into the house, the familiar weight of his reality settling back over him. And there it was, lying on the kitchen table where he'd left it, as if to mock his brief flight of fancy. The foreclosure notice. He picked it up, the crisp paper feeling like a death sentence in his hand. The red ink seemed to glow with malevolent energy. 30 days. No, 29 now. The brief warmth of his encounter with Ellie made the cold dread of this letter even more biting. The flicker of human connection had only served to highlight how profoundly alone he truly was. His isolation felt sharper, his failure more complete. He opened the refrigerator. A half-empty carton of milk, some wilting vegetables, and a single, lonely can of soup. Dinner. He heated it on the stove, the metallic smell filling the quiet kitchen. He sat at the table, spooning the tasteless broth into his mouth, his eyes fixed on the foreclosure notice. This paper was his truth. This was his reality. A woman with a kind smile was just a ghost, a temporary illusion. This debt, this farm, this failure, this was real. In her sterile, air-conditioned hotel room, Alara scrolled through the financial data, her expression hardening with every line. She saw it all laid out in cold, black and white numbers. The original loan for his father's catastrophic medical expenses, followed by the second, predatory loan from Northridge Financial to keep the farm afloat after the drought. The interest rates were criminal. The repayment terms were designed for failure. They weren't partners in his business. They were vultures waiting for the body to grow cold. Then she clicked on the next file, labeled Background. It was a collection of public records and notes from a local private investigator Marcus had already engaged. It contained dry facts, his birth date, his clean record, but it also contained anecdotes. How Liam had spent a weekend helping his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gable, reshingle her roof after a windstorm and refused to take a penny for it. How he donated a tenth of his meager harvest last year to the local church food pantry. How the man at the feed store described him as honest to a fault. The anger she felt toward the bank solidified into a cold, hard resolve. They had seen a good man in a desperate situation and decided to bleed him dry. They had mistaken his integrity for weakness. Liam Davies wasn't failing because he was a bad farmer. He was failing because he was a good man in a world that rewarded predators. She stared at the screen, at the story of a man being crushed by circumstances he couldn't control. The story of a man who, on what was likely one of the worst days of his life, had not hesitated to show kindness to a stranger. Her experiment was over. She had her answer. But now, it was no longer just an experiment. It had become personal. In his dark kitchen, Liam pushed his half-eaten bowl of soup away. The foreclosure notice seemed to mock him from across the table. He felt a chill, a deep, soul-level cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He felt invisible, a forgotten man being erased by a world that had no use for him. 1,000 miles away, in a room he could never imagine, the most powerful woman he had ever met, a woman he knew only as Ellie, read the final line of the report. She closed the tablet, the soft click echoing in the silent room. She had seen enough. She picked up her secure phone and dialed Marcus. "Get our legal team on the line," she said, her voice like ice. "I want them to draft an offer. We're buying a loan from Northridge Financial." The following morning, the generic hotel room had been transformed into a temporary war room. A sleek laptop and a second secure tablet sat on the desk, displaying encrypted spreadsheets and legal documents. The bland sailboat print on the wall looked down on a scene of immense, invisible power being marshaled. Alara, dressed in a simple but elegant silk blouse and trousers, was a study in focused intensity. She had slept for maybe 3 hours, but she was energized, fueled by a righteous anger she hadn't felt in years. Marcus stood by the window, a silent sentinel, as Alara conducted a series of calls with the sharpest legal minds at Vance Corporation. They were a world away, patched in through layers of secure encryption, their voices a disembodied chorus of deference. And as you can see from the attached file, Miss Vance, a lawyer named Peterson, was saying, Northridge Financial's portfolio is highly leveraged. They've been acquiring distressed agricultural debt aggressively. They're vulnerable to a buyout offer, especially one that settles above market value for a quick, clean resolution. "I don't want a clean resolution, Mr. Peterson," Alara cut in, her voice cold and precise. "I want their throat." "What's their exposure on Liam Davies' specific loan?" There was a pause. "Financially, it's negligible to them, a rounding error. But reputationally, given the predatory terms, if those terms were to be made public, it could be damaging." "Good," Alara said. "I want a full dossier. I want to know every corner they've cut, every desperate farmer they've squeezed. I am not just buying one loan. I am going to make them understand the true cost of their business model." She was in her element. This was a language she understood. Leverage, exposure, pressure points. It was a corporate raid, but the objective wasn't profit. It was justice. After the calls concluded, a quiet settled over the room. Marcus turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. This is more than just helping a man who was kind to you, he observed. It wasn't a question. Ilara leaned back in her chair, running a hand through her hair. The corporate armor she'd worn during the calls fell away, revealing the woman beneath. They're bullies, Marcus. They prey on good people who have hit a patch of bad luck. Liam Davies, he's just the one I happened to meet. How many others are out there, sitting at their kitchen tables with a foreclosure notice, thinking they're a failure? And what happens after? Marcus asked, his gaze steady and probing. You save his farm. You ride in like a knight in shining armor. Then what? Does that solve your problem? Or does it just make him another one of your assets? His question hit its mark, piercing through her anger to the core of her own dilemma. She stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the anonymous street below. Was that what she was doing? Was this just another application of her wealth? Another way to play God? Was she taking away Liam's struggle, and in doing so, taking away his agency? The thought was deeply unsettling. I asked myself the same thing all night, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Am I helping him, or am I just buying him? Am I trying to fix his life, or am I just trying to fix my own loneliness by turning him into some project? She turned to face her confidant. But then I read those reports. He isn't just a project. He's a good man. His character is the asset, Marcus. The farm is just the land it's built on. People like Julian Croft, they invest in things they can strip and sell for parts. I want to invest in something that grows. I admire his resilience, his integrity. What I'm doing, it isn't pity, it's respect. I'm not saving him from himself. I'm saving him from a system that is designed to crush people like him. Marcus nodded slowly, a flicker of approval in his eyes. He had seen her make countless business decisions based on cold logic. This was the first one he'd ever seen her make from the heart. What's the plan for North Ridge? He asked. A predatory gleam returned to Alara's eyes. Oh, the plan is very simple. I'm going to call Mr. Henderson personally. Mr. Henderson, senior loan officer at Northridge Financial, was having an excellent day. He had just closed on 2 more farm foreclosures and was enjoying a mid-morning coffee, congratulating himself on his ruthless efficiency. His direct line rang, an internal transfer from his assistant. Mr. Henderson, there's a Miss Eleanor Smith on the line for you regarding the Davies account, his assistant said. He sighed. He vaguely remembered the name Davies, the desperate farmer from the other day, probably calling to beg again. He'd put this Eleanor Smith, likely a sister or a bleeding heart relative, in her place quickly. Put her through, he said, taking a sip of his coffee. Mr. Henderson? A calm female voice said. It was smooth and confident, not what he expected. This is he said brusquely. I assume this is about the Davies property. As I explained to Mr. Davies, the bank's position is final. The foreclosure is proceeding. I'm aware, the voice said, an edge of ice in her tone that made him sit up a little straighter. I'm not calling to dispute it. I'm calling to inform you that your position is about to become irrelevant. Henderson scoffed. I beg your pardon? Who is this? My name is not important, she said. What is important is the offer my legal team is wiring to your CEO as we speak. We are offering to buy Mr. Davies' entire debt in cash at a 10% premium. Henderson was stunned into silence. Buy the debt? Who would do that for a failed farm? That's a highly irregular proposal. It's a very generous one, the voice countered, and it's only valid for the next 60 minutes. After that, my offer will still stand. But it will be accompanied by a press release sent to every major financial news outlet, detailing the predatory terms of your loan and featuring a rather heartbreaking interview with the 3-generation farmer you're about to put out on the street. I wonder how your other agricultural clients will feel about that. The blood drained from Henderson's face. This wasn't a relative. This was a professional, a shark. Who is this? He demanded again, his voice tight with panic. A new voice, a man's voice, suddenly cut in on the line. It was deep, calm, and carried an unmistakable air of authority. Mr. Henderson, Marcus said coolly, the person you are speaking to is Alara Vance. The name landed in the room like a grenade. The Alara Vance, of Vance Corporation. Henderson felt a wave of cold sweat break out on his forehead. He was so far out of his depth he couldn't even see the surface. I apologize, Miss Vance, he stammered, his earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by a terrified deference. I was unaware. I'll, I'll transfer you to our executive office immediately. Don't bother, Alara's voice returned, smooth as silk. They're already expecting my call. Your CEO will be accepting my offer. The farm will be solvent by noon. Your only job, Mr. Henderson, is to reflect on the fact that you nearly destroyed a good man's life over a rounding error. Have a pleasant day. She hung up. The click of the disconnected line was the loudest sound Henderson had ever heard. He stared at his phone, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had just been utterly and completely dismantled. In the hotel room, Alara closed her laptop. A profound sense of purpose washed over her, clean and sharp. She hadn't felt this alive in years. This wasn't the hollow victory of a corporate takeover. This was a righteous win. By lunchtime, it was done. A series of encrypted emails confirmed the transaction. A holding company, wholly owned by Alara, was now the sole owner of Liam Davies' debt. With a few keystrokes, she accessed the new account and marked the entire balance, paid in full. She downloaded the official digital deed, the proof of his freedom. She stared at it on the screen, a simple document that represented the lifting of an immense burden. It was the most satisfying acquisition she had ever made. She stood up, a new energy coursing through her. The experiment was over. The game was over. Now, something else was beginning. Marcus, she said, turning to him, a genuine, radiant smile on her face. Get the Bentley ready. And find me a good local printer who can create a high-quality, official-looking document from this file. Marcus raised an eyebrow. The Bentley? I thought we were maintaining a low profile. The time for a low profile is over, she said, her eyes shining with resolve. I deceived him once out of necessity. I won't do it again. He deserves to see exactly who I am. She paused, her smile softening. And I want to deliver the news myself. The sun was low in the sky, casting long, mournful shadows across the farm. For Liam, it felt like the world was holding a funeral, and he was the guest of honor. He stood in the cavernous quiet of his barn, the air thick with the smell of old hay, engine oil, and defeat. This was his lowest point. A nadir of despair so profound, it felt like the very ground had given way beneath him. He was selling his grandfather's tractor. It wasn't the main workhorse he used in the fields, the one held together with duct tape and prayer. This was the old one, a classic 1,952nd Farmall, cherry red and built like a bull. It hadn't run in years, but it was his most prized possession. It was a monument to a better time. His grandfather had taught him to drive on it, his small hands barely able to grip the enormous wheel, his feet unable to reach the pedals. Every scratch and dent was a memory. Selling it felt like cutting out a piece of his own heart. The man buying it, a scrap dealer named Sal, was hooking a winch cable to the front axle. Sal was not a sentimental man. To him, the tractor was just 4,000 pounds of steel, worth a few $100s melted down. She's a real beaut, Sal said, his words meant to be comforting but landing like stones. Shame to see her go to the scrap heap. Liam didn't answer. He just watched, his throat tight, as the winch began to strain. The tractor's old wheels, seized by decades of disuse, groaned in protest as they scraped across the barn's concrete floor. Each screech was a fresh wave of shame. He was doing this for a pittance, a few $100s that would barely cover his fuel bill for the month. It was a desperate, pointless gesture, the final act in a tragedy of his own making. It was then that he heard the sound. It was a low, powerful purr, a sound so alien and out of place it seemed to vibrate in the very air. It was the sound of money, of a world so far removed from his own it might as well have been another planet. He turned from the heartbreaking sight of the tractor and walked numbly out of the barn, shielding his eyes against the setting sun, and there it was. Rolling slowly up his long, dusty driveway was a car. But it wasn't just a car, it was a Bentley, a rolling sculpture of gleaming black paint and polished chrome, so pristine it seemed to repel the dust of his farm. It moved with a silent, arrogant grace, its presence an indictment of everything Liam's life had become. His heart sank. This had to be the bank. They hadn't even waited the full 30 days. They'd sent some top executive in a chariot of wealth to finalize the eviction, to survey the asset they were about to claim. The last dregs of his fighting spirit evaporated, replaced by a dull, resigned emptiness. He was done. The Bentley came to a perfect, silent stop. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the driver's side door opened, and a man in a crisp, dark suit emerged. Marcus. He moved to the passenger side and opened the door. Liam braced himself, expecting to see a cold-faced banker in a bespoke suit, a man like Henderson with ice in his veins. But the person who stepped out was not a man. It was a woman. And as she straightened up, the setting sun catching the confident line of her shoulders, Liam's world tilted, spun, and then shattered into a million pieces. It was Ellie. But it wasn't Ellie. The worn jeans and faded t-shirt were gone, replaced by a cream-colored pantsuit of such exquisite tailoring it looked as if it had been woven just for her. Her hair was no longer in a simple ponytail but fell in a dark, glossy wave over her shoulder. The friendly, slightly lost backpacker had vanished, and in her place stood a woman who radiated an aura of such immense power and effortless grace that it took his breath away. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. She was formidable. Liam just stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the two images. The woman on his porch and the goddess standing before him. It didn't compute. It was like seeing a stray cat you'd fed once return as a Bengal tiger. She took a few steps toward him, her expensive heels making no sound on the dusty ground. Her expression was serene, but he could see a flicker of uncertainty, of vulnerability, in her eyes. It was the only part of her he recognized. "Liam," she said, her voice the same, yet entirely different in this new context. "Ellie?" he managed to choke out, the name sounding absurd on his lips now. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "I owe you an apology for the deception, Liam. My name is Alara. Alara Vance." The name hung in the air between them. Vance. Even in his isolated world, he'd heard that name. Vance Corporation. The logo was on shipping containers, on tech news reports, on the very fabric of the modern world. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. This wasn't just a rich woman. This was a titan, a figure from a different reality altogether. I don't understand," he stammered, taking an involuntary step back. His mind was reeling. Had this all been a joke? A cruel, elaborate prank played by the super-rich for their own amusement? Was his poverty their entertainment? The thought sent a surge of hot, helpless anger through him. "I know this is a shock," Alara said, her voice calm and steady, trying to anchor him. "When I came here, I was looking for something." "Looking for what?" he asked, his voice rough with suspicion. "To see how the other half lives before they get kicked to the curb?" The accusation hit her, and he saw a flash of hurt in her eyes. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I was looking for something real. My life is full of people who want something from me, who see my name, not me. I was tired of the noise, of the pretense. I just wanted to find one person who would be kind, not because of what they could get, but just because it was the right thing to do." She took another step closer, her gaze intense, pleading with him to understand. "You were that person, Liam. You were struggling, I could see it in your eyes. But you didn't hesitate. You offered help to a total stranger. That act, that simple kindness, it was the most real thing I've experienced in a very long time." He just stared at her, his anger warring with a profound confusion. He glanced back toward the barn, where Sal was still fiddling with the winch. The sight of his grandfather's tractor being prepared for slaughter brought him crashing back to his bleak reality. "Kindness doesn't pay the bills," he said bitterly, gesturing toward the barn. "That's real. That's what's real." Alara's eyes followed his gaze. She saw the tractor, saw the winch cable, and understood instantly what was happening. Her expression softened with a deep, aching empathy. She looked back at him, and her gaze fell to the crumpled, grease-stained paper sticking out of his back pocket. A bill, or something worse. She reached into the elegant leather portfolio Marcus had handed her and pulled out a single, crisp sheet of paper. It was thick, expensive stock, bearing the official letterhead of a corporate entity he didn't recognize. "You're right," she said softly. "Kindness doesn't pay the bills. Which is why I made a few calls after I left." She held the paper out to him. He didn't take it. He just stared at her, his mind unable to process what was happening. "My company bought your loan from Northridge Financial this morning," she explained, her voice gentle. "As of noon today, The debt on Providence Ridge has been settled, in full. Liam felt the words like a physical impact, like the air had been punched from his lungs. It was impossible. A dream. He looked from her sincere, earnest face to Marcus, who gave a single, slow nod of confirmation. He looked at the paper she was holding. "Why?" he whispered, the single word encompassing a universe of disbelief. "Why would you do that?" "Because you told me the land shouldn't lie," she said, her voice unwavering. "And I believe that good men shouldn't be broken by bad luck. You said you were losing your hold on something real. I couldn't let that happen." She took his hand, her skin soft against his calloused, greasy palm, and pressed the document into it. "Consider it an investment," she said, "an investment in authenticity." He looked down at the paper. He read the words, but they swam before his eyes. Paid in full. It was stamped across the page in the same bold red ink as the foreclosure notice. But this time, it was a proclamation of liberation, not doom. He looked up at her, at this impossible woman who had appeared like a ghost and was now offering him salvation. The anger, the suspicion, it all washed away, replaced by a wave of emotion so overwhelming he felt his knees might buckle. The farm was his. He wasn't losing it. The weight that had been crushing him for years, the weight of his father's illness, of the drought, of the bank, of his own perceived failure, it was gone, lifted in an instant by a woman he barely knew. He was free. But he was also completely, utterly adrift in a new reality he didn't understand. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been annihilated, remade into something he had no map for. He was no longer just a farmer, and she was no longer just a traveler. And standing there in the twilight, with the deed to his own life in his hand, he had no idea what came next. The first thing Liam did was walk back into the barn. He moved like a man in a dream, the heavy, official paper clutched in his hand as if it were a holy relic. Sal, the scrap dealer, had just managed to drag the old Farmall tractor to the barn door. "All right, she's ready to load up," Sal said, wiping sweat from his brow. Liam looked at the tractor, at its faded red paint and proud, silent engine. A wave of profound relief, so powerful it was dizzying, washed over him. He wasn't losing this piece of his history. He wasn't losing anything. "I've changed my mind," Liam said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I'm not selling." Sal blinked, lowering his greasy rag. "What?" "We had a deal." Liam reached into his pocket, pulled out the small, crumpled wad of cash Sal had given him as a deposit, and handed it back, along with 2 extra $20 bills from his own near-empty wallet. "Here's your deposit back. And this is for your time and your trouble. I apologize." Sal stared at the money, then at Liam's face, then at the impossible black car gleaming in the yard, and the woman who stood beside it like a queen. He was a simple man, but he knew how to read a situation. Something had fundamentally changed in the last 10 minutes. He shrugged, pocketed the cash, and began unhooking his winch. "Your tractor, your call." With the crisis averted, Liam turned back to face Alara. She had remained by the car, giving him the space to handle his business. Now, as he walked toward her, the full, crushing weight of the new reality descended upon him. What do you say to someone who has just handed you back your life? Thank you felt like trying to bail out the ocean with a thimble. It was a hopelessly inadequate collection of sounds. The silence between them was thick, with everything unsaid. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, and the air grew cool. "You said on the phone." "You said you were calling for a tow," he said finally, the words sounding clumsy and foolish. "I know," she said softly. "I'm sorry, Liam. The car wasn't broken. The whole thing was a setup. I told you, I was looking for something real," he finished for her, the phrase echoing in the quiet air. He looked at the Bentley, a machine so perfect it seemed to have been beamed down from another world. "And you came here to find it?" "Yes." He shook his head, a gesture of pure bewilderment. He felt a chasm opening between them, a canyon of wealth and experience so vast he couldn't see the other side. His simple farmhouse, the place he had always called home, suddenly felt small and shabby. His worn clothes felt like a costume for a pauper. He was intensely aware of the grease under his fingernails, the dust on his boots, the sheer, unbridgeable gap between their lives. And awkward pauses stretched. The crickets began their nightly chorus, oblivious to the human drama playing out in the yard. I have coffee, he offered, the words feeling ridiculous as soon as they left his mouth. Offering coffee to a woman who probably had a personal barista. Or water. It's from a well. A genuine smile touched Alara's lips, warming her face and chasing away some of the formidable aura. The offer was so simple, so earnest. It was exactly what she needed to hear. I'd love a cup of coffee, she said. He led the way to the house, hyper-aware of her presence behind him. He imagined her seeing the peeling paint on the porch rail, the worn spot on the welcome mat, the screen door that didn't quite shut right. He held the door for her, and she stepped into his kitchen. The room, which had always felt cozy and familiar, now seemed to shrink under her gaze. The faded linoleum, the chipped Formica countertop, the simple wooden table. It all looked desperately humble. He felt his pride, the one thing he had left, beginning to sting. He was a project, a charity case, a feel-good story for a bored billionaire. He busied himself with the coffee maker, his movements stiff and clumsy. Alara didn't sit down. She stood in the middle of the room, looking at the faded photograph of his parents on the wall. They look happy, she said. They were, Liam replied, his back still to her. They loved this place. My dad built that table himself. She ran a hand over the smooth, worn wood of the kitchen table. It's beautiful. It has character. He scoffed. A short, bitter sound. It's old. Like everything else around here. Alara heard the defensiveness in his voice, the wounded pride. She knew this was the most dangerous moment. Liam, she said, her voice gentle but firm, forcing him to turn and look at her. I know what you're thinking, and you're wrong. This isn't charity, and you are not my project. Then what is it? He challenged, his eyes dark with confusion and a touch of anger. You can't just drop out of the sky and fix someone's life and pretend it's nothing. It's not nothing, she countered, her own frustration rising. It's the most important thing I've done in years. Don't you see? You gave me something first. You gave me proof that what I was looking for actually exists. All I did was balance the scales. I hate debt, Liam, all kinds of debt. And after our conversation, I felt like I was in your debt. The coffee maker sputtered, finishing its cycle. Liam poured 2 mugs, his hands trembling slightly. He handed one to her, their fingers brushing again. This time, he was acutely aware of the difference her manicured nails against his rough, scarred skin. I have to pay you back, he said, his voice low and stubborn. I don't know how, but I will. No, she said simply. You won't. This isn't a loan, Liam. It's a grant for being a decent human being. Besides, she added, a wry smile playing on her lips, my financial advisors would tell you that Providence Ridge is now an asset in my portfolio. I'm just protecting my investment. Framing it in business terms seemed to ease some of the tension in his shoulders. He finally took a sip of his coffee, the familiar bitterness, a small comfort. They stood in silence for a moment, the gulf between them still there, but perhaps a little less wide. To fill the quiet, he started talking. He told her about the farm, not the struggles, but the history. He pointed out the window to the old oak and told her the story his father had told him, about how it was planted the same year his great-grandfather bought the land. As he spoke, she listened, genuinely listened. She asked questions, not polite, vapid questions, but smart, insightful ones. She asked about crop rotation, about soil health, about the challenges of organic farming versus conventional. She was sharp, and her interest was real. For the first time all evening, Liam forgot about the Bentley in his driveway. He forgot about her suit and her name. He was just a farmer, talking about the land he loved, to a woman who seemed to actually understand. The awkwardness began to melt away, replaced by a tentative, fragile connection. At one point, a log in the old wood stove in the corner shifted, sending a puff of smoke into the room. Without thinking, Liam moved to adjust the flue. The handle was stuck. Let me, Alara said, stepping forward. She picked up a small iron poker, found the perfect angle for leverage, and gave it a sharp, precise rap. The handle popped free. Liam stared at her. How did you know how to do that? She shrugged, a faint blush on her cheeks. My grandfather had a cabin in Colorado with a stove just like this one. I spent summers there. It was the only place my father couldn't reach me on the phone. In that small, shared memory of grandfathers and wood stoves, they found a piece of common ground. And for the first time, Liam laughed. A real, genuine laugh. The sound surprised them both. She smiled back, and in that moment, she wasn't Ilara Vance, CEO. She was just a woman who knew her way around a wood stove, sharing a cup of coffee in a warm kitchen. The spell was broken by a discreet cough from the doorway. Marcus stood there, a figure of patient professionalism. "Ma'am, it's getting late." Alara looked from Marcus to Liam, the awareness of their two worlds crashing back in. "I should go," she said, her voice softer now. Will I see you again?" Liam asked, the question hanging in the air, full of risk. "I'd like to come back and check on my investment," she said, the business term now a private joke between them. "If that's all right," he said. He walked her to the door, the distance between them feeling different now, charged with a new and unfamiliar current. He watched as Marcus held the Bentley's door for her, and she slipped inside. The car purred to life and pulled away, its red taillights disappearing into the darkness, leaving Liam alone on his porch. He looked down at the paper still in his hand. Paid in full. He then looked out at the fields. His fields. His future. The crippling weight of dread was gone, replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating sense of possibility. The farm was his. But his life, he was beginning to realize, was no longer just his own. It was now inextricably linked to the incredible, impossible woman in the Bentley. Ilara kept her word. 2 days later, a modest but new SUV, a practical vehicle that didn't scream billionaire, rolled up Liam's driveway. She stepped out, not in a power suit, but in a pair of well-fitting jeans, sturdy boots, and a simple cashmere sweater. It was a carefully chosen uniform, an attempt to bridge the gap between their worlds. She was no longer pretending to be a backpacker, but she was deliberately shedding the armor of Ilara Vance. That first visit set the pattern for the weeks that followed. Ilara became a regular fixture at Providence Ridge. At first, it was awkward. Liam, now free from the crushing weight of debt, poured all his energy into the farm with a renewed vigor he hadn't felt in years. He insisted on showing her his plans, unrolling sketches for a new irrigation system, and lists of organic seeds he could now afford. He was treating her like an investor, a business partner, determined to prove her grant was worthwhile. But Ilara gently steered their interactions away from balance sheets and toward the soil itself. She wanted to understand, not just observe. She helped him mend the section of fence that had been listing to one side since his father passed. Her hands, soft and unaccustomed to labor, were clumsy at first, but she was a quick learner. Liam found himself showing her how to properly stretch the wire, their hands brushing, their heads close together as he explained the tension required. The air between them crackled with an energy that had nothing to do with fence repair. They fell into a comfortable, unspoken routine. She would arrive in the late morning, and they would work together on a project clearing stones from a field he hoped to reclaim, repairing a leaky roof on the chicken coop, or simply walking the property while he explained his vision for the future. He discovered she had a sharp, analytical mind that could cut through a problem with surprising clarity. She discovered a deep, grounding peace in the rhythm of physical labor, a satisfaction she never found in closing a multi-million-dollar deal. The real connection, however, was forged over the simple meals they shared. He would cook for them in the kitchen, no longer ashamed of its humility. They would sit at the table his father had built, and they would talk for hours. He spoke of his childhood on the farm, the stories behind every scar on the land. She, in turn, began to open up about her own life, not the glamorous parts, but the lonely ones. She told him about her grandfather's cabin in Colorado, about feeling like a ghost in her own life, about her deep yearning for something authentic. In the quiet intimacy of that kitchen, they weren't a billionaire and a farmer. They were just Liam and Ilara, two people discovering a rare and profound connection. The romance between them grew not in a flash of passion, but organically, like a slow-growing seed finding purchase in fertile ground. It was in the lingering glances over coffee cups, the comfortable silences while watching the sunset from the porch, the way he would instinctively reach out to steady her on uneven ground. One crisp autumn afternoon, they were returning from a long walk to the creek at the edge of the property. The leaves were a riot of golden red, and the air was clean and sharp. They stopped under the old oak tree, the heart of the farm. I haven't felt this calm in my entire adult life, Alara confessed, her voice soft. It's quiet here. My life is so loud. It's not always quiet, Liam said, smiling. The coyotes make a racket some nights, and the old generator can wake the dead. That's not the kind of loud I mean, she said, looking up at him. That's the sound of life. The noise I'm used to is the sound of expectation. He saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the same look he'd seen that first day she'd appeared on his driveway. Without thinking, driven by an impulse that felt as natural as breathing, he reached out and gently brushed a stray leaf from her hair. His fingers grazed her cheek. The touch was electric. The world seemed to stop for a heartbeat. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment. He slowly lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a demanding or passionate kiss. It was a kiss of quiet discovery, tentative and deeply tender. It was a confirmation of everything that had been growing between them, a silent acknowledgement that this was more than just friendship, more than an investment. When they broke apart, they simply looked at each other, a new, profound understanding passing between them. Their partnership had just been renegotiated, but their idyllic bubble was fragile. The world outside the farm's fences had begun to notice. The town of Northwood was small, and gossip was its primary currency. The sight of a brand new SUV making regular trips to the once struggling Davies farm was cause for intense speculation. At the local feed and supply store, where Liam was a regular, the owner, a gruff but decent man named Hank, pulled him aside. "That's a nice lady you got coming around, Liam," Hank said, trying to sound casual. "Good to see you getting back on your feet." There was genuine warmth in his voice. Others were not so kind. A few days later, Liam was in line at the town's only grocery store. He heard two women whispering behind him. "That's him, the farmer. I heard some rich city woman paid off all his debt." "Paid it off? I heard she bought the whole farm. He's probably just her gardener now." The words were like a physical slap. Liam's face burned with humiliation. He grabbed his groceries, paid without making eye contact, and fled the store. He felt like an exhibit in a zoo, the local boy who'd been saved by a wealthy benefactress. His salvation, which had felt so personal and profound, was being twisted by public perception into something cheap and transactional. The final crack in their bubble came from the internet. A local blogger, who ran a small-town news site, wrote a short, speculative piece titled, "Hometown Farmers' Fortunes Reversed by Mystery Heiress." It was mostly conjecture, but it included a grainy cell phone picture of Alara getting out of her SUV in front of Liam's farmhouse. Within 48 hours, the story was picked up by a national gossip website. They recognized Alara immediately. The new headline was far more direct. "Billionaire Alara Vance's new pet project? Reclusive heiress buys farm for handsome country beau." The article was condescending and speculative, painting Liam as a handsome simpleton who had won the lottery and Alara as a bored rich girl looking for a rustic diversion. The idyllic peace of Providence Ridge was shattered. Liam saw the article when Alara, her face pale, showed it to him on her tablet. He read the words pet project and country beau, and something inside him curdled. All his deepest insecurities, the ones he thought he had buried, came roaring back to the surface. He wasn't her partner. He was her charity case. He wasn't a man she respected. He was a plaything. He became quiet, distant. The easy laughter between them disappeared. When they worked together, he was formal and polite, explaining tasks as if she were a temporary employee. The warmth was gone, replaced by a cool, defensive wall. The breaking point came after a trip to the supply store to pick up fencing wire. The whole time, he felt eyes on them. He saw people whispering, pointing. He imagined their snickering, their pity. He was silent and sullen the entire drive back to the farm. As they got out of the truck, Alara finally confronted him. "Liam, talk to me." "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he said, his voice tight as he unloaded the wire. "Don't do that," she said, her voice sharp with frustration. "Don't shut me out. This is about that article, isn't it?" He finally spun around to face her, his face a mask of wounded pride. "Of course it's about the article. It's about everyone in town looking at me like I'm some kind of kept man, like I'm your hobby." "You know that's not true," she insisted. taking a step toward him. How can you even think that? How can I not? He shot back, his voice rising. Look at us. Ilara. Look at this. He gestured wildly, encompassing her expensive SUV, his miraculously debt-free farm, the whole impossible situation. None of this is real for me. I didn't earn it. You came here and you waved your magic wand, and now I'm just the man you saved. That's all I'll ever be. The words, born of his deepest fear, were a dagger to her heart. All she had ever wanted was to be seen for who she was, not for her money. And now, the man she was falling in love with was throwing that very money in her face, using it as a wall between them. The first real crack had appeared in their carefully constructed world, and it threatened to swallow them both. The argument hung in the air between them, thick and toxic. For 2 days, an uneasy truce held. They moved around each other with a pained, careful distance, the easy intimacy they had built now feeling like a distant memory. The silences were no longer comfortable. They were heavy with unspoken resentments and wounded feelings. Liam threw himself into his work with a frantic energy, as if he could physically outrun his insecurities. Ilara spent her time walking the property alone, the beautiful landscape now feeling alien and unwelcoming. Their sanctuary had become a battlefield. The storm broke on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky itself seemed to mirror their turmoil, a bruised purple gray that threatened a storm. Liam was in the machine shed, trying to diagnose a problem with an old cultivator, his knuckles bloody from a slipped wrench. He was using the physical task to distract from the emotional chaos churning inside him. He didn't hear the car at first over the clang of metal on metal. It wasn't Ilara's discreet SUV. This was the sound of raw, unapologetic power, the throaty, arrogant roar of a high-performance engine. He stepped out of the shed, wiping grease from his hands, and his blood ran cold. A low-slung, fiery red Ferrari had just pulled to a stop in his yard, its engine rumbling like a predator. It was a machine built for speed, status, and seduction, and it looked utterly, offensively out of place on his humble farm. The driver's door opened, and a man unfolded himself from the cockpit. He was tall, dressed in a casual but clearly expensive linen shirt and designer sunglasses. It was Julian Croft. He surveyed the farm with an expression of open disdain, his gaze sweeping over the old barn, the modest farmhouse, and finally settling on Liam with a smirk. He was the physical embodiment of the world Ilara had tried to escape, and he had just brought that world crashing into Liam's front yard. "So," Julian said, his voice smooth and laced with condescension as he removed his sunglasses. "This is the rustic paradise. I must say, it has a certain agricultural charm." Liam's hands curled into fists at his sides. He said nothing, just stood his ground, a wall of simmering fury. "I'm looking for Ilara Vance," Julian continued, taking a step forward as if he owned the place. "I assume she's here, communing with the common man." At that moment, the farmhouse door opened, and Ilara stepped out onto the porch. She had heard the car. Her face went pale when she saw Julian, her expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. "Julian," she said, her voice dripping ice, "what are you doing here?" "What am I doing?" He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "I'm staging an intervention, darling. I saw that pathetic little gossip piece. I thought you had simply gotten lost, but it seems you've acquired a pet." He flicked his gaze dismissively toward Liam. "You need to leave," Ilara said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Oh, I'll leave," Julian said, strolling closer to the porch, completely ignoring Liam. "But not before I remind you of who you are. You're Ilara Vance. Your name opens doors. It moves markets. You don't belong in this dirt patch, playing house with a farmhand whose only asset is a decent jawline." Every word was a perfectly calibrated insult, designed to strike at the heart of Liam's deepest insecurities. Farmhand, dirt patch, asset. Julian was confirming every terrible thing Liam had been thinking about himself. He felt a hot, blinding rage build behind his eyes. "She asked you to leave," Liam said, his voice a low growl. Julian finally turned his full attention to Liam, looking him up and down as if he were an interesting piece of livestock. "And you are? The beneficiary? Let me give you some advice, farmer. Her world will chew you up and spit you out. You're a diversion, a brief, charitable impulse. When she gets bored of the simple life, and she will, she'll be back in a boardroom. And you'll be right back here, wondering how you're going to pay for your next bag of fertilizer. That's enough, Julian, Alara snapped, descending the porch steps to stand between them. But Julian wasn't finished. He looked directly at Liam, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Tell me, did she buy you new boots too? Or do those come after you've proven you can be properly house-trained? That was it. The dam of Liam's control broke. He took a menacing step forward, his entire body radiating violence. Get off my property, now. Your property? Julian laughed, a genuinely amused sound this time. Don't be naive. It's her property. You're just living on it. You're a tenant in your own life, my friend. Before Liam could move, before the violence simmering in him could erupt, Alara stepped directly in his path, placing a hand on his chest. Liam, no. Don't, she pleaded, her eyes begging him. He's not worth it. This is what he wants. She turned back to Julian, her expression utterly glacial. You are no longer welcome in my life, Julian, in any capacity. The fact that you tracked me down and came here to do this, it's pathetic. Now get in your ridiculous car and disappear. Julian saw the finality in her eyes. He had overplayed his hand. He gave a theatrical shrug, a smirk still on his face. Fine. Have fun with your rustic experiment. When you're ready to come back to civilization, you know my number. He slid back into the Ferrari, revved the engine one last time in a final act of dominance, and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust and humiliation in his wake. For a long moment, there was only silence, broken by the distant rumble of the departing car. The air was thick with the poison Julian had left behind. Alara turned to Liam, her face etched with apology and concern. Liam, I am so sorry. Don't, he said, shrugging her hand off his chest as if it burned him. He wouldn't look at her. He was staring at the dust cloud, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped. He's an arrogant, cruel man, she said desperately. You can't listen to anything he said, can't I? Liam finally turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her flinch. The warmth, the tenderness she had come to know, was gone. It was replaced by a cold, wounded fury. He just said what everyone else is thinking, didn't he? What you're probably thinking. That's not true, she cried, her voice cracking. How could you believe that? Because he's right about one thing, isn't he? Liam's voice was raw with pain. This is your property. I'm living on your charity. You talk about wanting something real, but what part of this is real? You're slumming it, Alara. You're a tourist in my life. And when the vacation is over, you'll go back to your penthouses and your boardrooms. And what will I be? I'll be the farmer you once saved. A funny story you tell at your dinner parties. Each word was a hammer blow, fueled by his shame and her perceived betrayal. You think this is a game to me? She shot back, her own hurt now turning to anger. You think my feelings for you are a game? I came here to escape people like him, and you're throwing his words in my face. Maybe he's right about you too. Maybe you'll never be able to see past my money. Maybe you're so blinded by your own pride that you can't see what's right in front of you. What's in front of me is a woman who solved my life's biggest problem with a single phone call, he yelled, his control completely gone. You didn't give me a chance, you just took it over. You think that's a partnership? That's a takeover. You bought me, Alara, whether you meant to or not. The accusation, so deeply unfair, so profoundly hurtful, stole the breath from her lungs. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of anger, of frustration, of a deep, aching heartbreak. This man, the one person she thought saw the real her, was now looking at her and seeing only a walking bank account. I can't do this, she whispered, her voice breaking. She backed away, shaking her head as if to ward off his words. I can't. She turned and ran not toward the farmhouse, but toward her SUV. She fumbled for the keys, her hands shaking, and jumped inside. Liam stood frozen in the yard, his chest heaving, the venom of his own words still tasting bitter in his mouth. He watched as she started the car and drove away, much faster than she normally did, gravel spraying from beneath her tires. He stood there until her car was gone, until the dust had settled once more. The threatened storm in the sky finally broke, a low rumble of thunder echoing in the distance. The farm was his. The tractor was safe in the barn, the debt was gone. He had everything he had ever wished for, and he had never felt more alone in his entire life. The storm that broke over Providence Ridge that evening was violent. Rain lashed against the windows of the farmhouse, and wind howled through the eaves, a perfect mirror for the tempest in Liam's soul. He didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table his father had built, the one where he and Alara had shared coffee and laughter, and let the weight of his own words crush him. He had driven her away. The one person who had seen past his failure, who had looked at his broken life and seen potential, who had offered him not just a lifeline but genuine affection, and he had thrown it all back in her face. The poison of Julian's words had found fertile ground in his own insecurity, and he had allowed his wounded pride to bloom into a cruel, ugly thing. When the storm passed just before dawn, Liam walked out into the newly washed world. The air was clean and cool. He walked the land, his boots sinking into the damp earth. He walked to the old oak tree, its leaves glistening with raindrops, and placed a hand on its rough, steady bark. His grandfather had said the land remembers. Liam realized, with a clarity that was sharp and painful, that his own pride had made him forget the most important thing. Alara's act hadn't been about power, it had been about faith. She hadn't bought his farm, she had invested in his character. She had seen the man he wanted to be, the man he had been before debt and despair had ground him down, and he had repaid that faith with suspicion and anger. He had been so focused on the wound to his pride that he failed to see the gift offered to his heart. He saw now that true partnership wasn't about an equal balance sheet. It was about standing together, shoring up each other's weaknesses, and celebrating each other's strengths. He had been offered a true partner, and he had pushed her away because he was too proud to accept the help he desperately needed. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't about apologizing. An apology was just words. He needed to show her. He spent the rest of the day in a fever of activity, not in the fields, but at his kitchen table with a stack of paper, a calculator, and the old laptop he rarely used. He wasn't just a farmer. He was a man with a future, and it was time he started acting like one. Alara drove back to the city in a daze of heartbreak. She didn't go to a hotel. She went straight to the penthouse, the gilded cage, and it had never felt more like a prison. The silence was absolute, the priceless art cold and mocking. Marcus had the good sense to leave her alone. For a full day, she allowed herself to grieve. She grieved for the simple peace she had found, for the rare, beautiful connection she had felt. She was furious with Liam for his pride, but she was also honest enough with herself to understand it. She had, in her own way, been naive. She had thought she could simply erase his problems with money and expect everything else to fall into place. She had fixed his financial world, but she had failed to understand the delicate ecosystem of his dignity. The next morning, however, the grief began to harden into resolve. She was not the same woman who had fled this apartment weeks ago. She had found something real inside herself on that farm, a strength that wasn't tied to her net worth. And she would not let a man like Julian Croft be the author of the final chapter. She called a meeting, not with her lawyers, but with her father and the executive board. She walked into the boardroom on the 54th floor, not in a power suit, but in the simple jeans and sweater she had worn at the farm. She looked them all in the eye, these powerful men who had tried to shape her life. "My involvement with Julian Croft, both personally and professionally, is over," she announced, her voice calm and absolute. "Furthermore, I will be taking a more active role in the Vance Foundation. I'm restructuring it. We're going to be focusing on grants and support for sustainable agriculture and wiping out predatory debt in rural communities." Her father started to protest, but she held up a hand. "This is not a negotiation. This is my life. I have found something more valuable than market share and quarterly earnings. I have found a purpose. You can either support me in that, or you can watch me do it from the sidelines." She stood there, not as an heiress, but as her own woman. She had finally integrated the two halves of herself, the compassionate woman who fell in love with a farmer, and the powerful CEO who could change the world. She had completed her own liberation. 2 days after the fight, Alara drove the SUV back down the long, dusty driveway of Providence Ridge. Her heart hammered in her chest. She had no idea what she would find, or if he would even speak to her. She had simply decided that what they had was too rare to be abandoned without one last fight. She found him in the barn. He was hunched over a workbench, not fixing machinery, but poring over a stack of papers. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and his face was a mixture of hope and deep apprehension. The air was thick with unspoken apologies, But words were what had broken them. They needed a different language now. Without a word, Liam gestured for her to come over. He turned the papers toward her. It wasn't an apology note. It was a meticulously drafted, 20-page business plan. The title on the cover page read, "The Providence Ridge Cooperative, a proposal for a sustainable farming initiative." She stared at it, then at him. He began to speak, not with the anger of their last encounter, but with a quiet, passionate confidence she had never heard from him before. "I was wrong," he began, his voice steady. "My pride got in the way. You didn't invest in a charity case, Alara. You invested in an opportunity. And this is the prospectus." He walked her through it. It was brilliant. It was a plan to not only make his own farm a model of sustainable organic farming, but to create a cooperative with his neighbors. He had outlined plans for shared equipment costs, a direct-to-market produce service for local restaurants, and a program to help other small farmers restructure predatory debt using the knowledge of the system he had gained from his own painful experience. It was a plan for growth, for community, for empowerment. It was his way of taking her gift and multiplying it, turning his personal salvation into a force for good. He had met her grand gesture not with resentment, but with a vision that was even grander in its own way. "This isn't a plan to pay you back," he said, his eyes meeting hers, full of the sincerity she had first seen on her porch. "Because I can never do that. This is a plan to pay it forward. This is my way of showing you that I want to be your partner." In this, he patted the business plan, and in everything else. "If you'll have me," tears welled in Alara's eyes, but this time they were tears of profound, overwhelming joy. This was the proof she needed. This was the man she had fallen in love with, not a victim, not a project, but a visionary, an equal. She didn't answer with words. She simply reached out, took the business plan from his hands, set it on the workbench, and kissed him. It was a kiss that held a world of forgiveness, of understanding, and of a deep, unshakable love. It was the closing of one chapter and the passionate beginning of the next. As they stood in the quiet of the barn, the late afternoon sun streaming through the dusty air, they were no longer a billionaire and a farmer. They were just two people, two partners, who had navigated a storm and found their way back to each other, stronger and more certain than before. Together, they looked out at the land, no longer just his past, but their shared future. A future they would build together, a harvest of the heart grown from a single seed of kindness. Thank you for joining us on this journey at UpStory. We believe that everyone has the capacity for kindness, and that love can be found in the most unexpected of places. What did you think of Liam and Alara's story? Do you believe a single moment can truly change a life? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story and want more tales that uplift and inspire, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Your support allows us to keep sharing stories that matter. Until next time, thank you for watching.